Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. When Russia invaded Ukraine in late February 2022, this show focused intensely on the human and geopolitical consequences, and we've kept an eye on the war ever since. Sean Penn has won the Academy Award for Best Actor twice. He's a formidable talent who doesn't suffer fools. He's also a public figure who attracts attention and criticism. Here's where it all comes together. Sean Penn has produced a documentary about Ukraine and its leader, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. The movie is called Superpower. We sat down with Sean recently, and we started with what seemed to me an obvious question. Why is the movie called Superpower?
Well, it occurred to me that we all thought we knew which one between the Russians and the Ukrainians was the so-called superpower. And as it turns out, a superpower demands a lot more strength than just weapons.
Or numbers.
Or numbers.
It strikes me, having watched the movie several times, that superpower is not only literal, but it's metaphorical. Mm. You're talking about something deeper, and something that you discovered not just in President Zelenskyy, but in Ukrainians you met across the country. Yeah. What is that thing?
Well, I think I think that it is that this courage that we've all been so inspired by, the fortitude, is not a function of a Ukrainian man or woman looking in the mirror and saying, I got this. That's not even realistic, and maybe shouldn't be. But what is realistic is that when I is we, it happens. And that courage is available because it's shared. And the unity that they have shown in the purpose of freedom and the right to dream, to select their own destiny, is an aspiration that I believe is the most beautiful and strongest aspiration and bravest aspiration at the seed of our experiment. Mm-hmm. And that it's a very fragile thing, and that we're on the verge of losing it. And
we as Americans.
Yeah. And I don't know that they would have identified theirs without something we should take great pride in, which is that our founding fathers were Ukraine of another time. But as the world works, it's going to happen different places in different times. And the way to be a great nation is to recognize the greatness in another and let it remind you of what your job is internally. So all of these things have to do with this idea of superpower, and also because, you know, there's what Stan McChrystal called an inverted leadership, that leaders who really lead have to recognize in young people because they have skill sets that are organic to them. That for the rest of us, we're playing catch up. For some of us, I can't catch up.
Right.
And that's the case with the United States and Ukraine. There's an inverted leadership. And what will make us a giant is to embrace that. It's sort of the Thomas Jefferson line, one that I posted in defiance as a young man on the back of my bedroom door. Our children are born free, and that freedom is a gift of nature and not of those who gave them birth. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the case with Ukraine, and we should celebrate as Americans that this torch is being passed on, but also use it as an opportunity to reinvent our own.
The movie strikes me as not just a story about Ukraine, about this moment in history, about what may come from it, but also a story about the reciprocal relationship you just described. They look to us for inspiration. You want us to see that and find that again in ourselves.
finding it again in ourselves and make sure that they're able to hold on to theirs, and that we don't only look at it as in wartime, because of course there'll be susceptibility to that unity fracturing in Ukraine in peacetime. But the world takes the opportunity now to rewrite this notion that it's always going to be the law of the jungle. And in anticipation is working with leadership and is working in solidarity with the Ukrainians. It is, I think it's morally a sacred duty. But I would be remiss if I didn't also remind Americans that under both Republican and Democratic leadership did we arrive at the Budapest Memorandum, where when Ukraine had the third largest nuclear weapons cache, they were convinced by the U.S. and the Russians that even the threat of violating the sovereignty of Ukraine would be punishable by the equivalent of a NATO presence. And we've let Russia take our potential as anti-proliferation negotiators and chuck it in the toilet. We promised them something.
Right, because they took a risk. And those nation states that have either acquired nuclear weapons or are in pursuit of them look at that and say, if you want to protect yourself or if you want to have leverage in any geopolitical conversation, one of the best ways to obtain that leverage is to either develop, and if you have, keep your nuclear weapon. Because they'll point at Ukraine, see what happens? You give them up, and you lose that leverage.
Right. And then you bookend that with using the very unlikely, but yes, possible scenario where someone like Putin would use a nuclear weapon. And is the choice then, I'll be your I don't think so. Of course, we want to do everything we can to avoid that, but we don't want to hand this problem of it leveraged against us and held over our heads, the world's heads. We don't want to pass that on to our kids, so we got to take it on. And the Ukrainians they are not going to let this, as much better said than me by one of the witnesses testifying in our piece. You know, the Ukrainians are not going to allow a gangster with nukes to dictate what they do.
They're just not.
They're just not.
As was said in the movie, they will have to kill all of us.
That's right.
Because they're not going to stop defending their sovereignty, defending, as was also said in the movie, their right to make a choice.
Right. And when the us comes to the United States, does us exist in decisively saying no is no? We are not going to let you prove that you can leverage with the threat of this gangsterism, this murder. I think there's a time for restraint, and movingly so with President Kennedy's restraint in the Cuban Missile Crisis. But when restraint is an overabundance of caution, caution becomes cowardice, and there's no us left in cowardice. It's surrender to the absence of good that Putin represents.
When we come back, the origins of Sean Penn's documentary on Zelenskyy. And I want to let you know the original idea, it had nothing to do with war. That's when we come back.
It's an old idea that there is this really big group of pro-Russian sympathizers. That was true. But this is a new Ukraine.
Welcome back to the Takeout. When Ukraine elected Volodymyr Zelenskyy as president, it was a country in transition. It wanted to be free of Russian influence and corrupt oligarchs, but somehow the money men kept getting their way. The country, still trying to assert a post-Soviet identity, was looking for genuine change. Sean Penn's documentary tells that story too. Penn was fascinated by its new leader, a comedian who played the fake president on TV.
He was one of the most famous actors, not just in Ukraine, of all territory of the Soviet Union. He not be an actor who is sitting and waiting what happened around him. He was producer, he was director, he always was the leader.
Я сразу хочу сказать, у нас сегодня просто концерт, никакой агитации.
He was making these silly shows which showed Ukrainians and Ukraine in a very disappointing way. And of course, as a Ukrainian, I didn't like that. But then I talked to people in smaller villages and said, finally, we are heard.
Penn set out to make a film about Zelenskyy, the charismatic comedian turned president in a country yearning for something new. And then war got in the way. Talk to me a little bit about the origins of this project. Where it landed is not where it started.
No, and it's still something I'm processing because I've never set out to do, I don't think I would have ever taken interest in a documentary. I'd produced some documentaries, but I'd never directed one, in this case co-directed one. And it would never have been my instinct to do something lighthearted. Clearly it's not my first foot forward, Mr. Self-Serious. But something about Zelenskyy, it was really interesting to me when it was proposed, and this is Word of Russian buildup. Of course, I always feel I have to restate for some people who aren't thinking about it that, since 2014, there has been a continued border conflict that has cost some thousands of lives. But by and large, Ukraine's been living as a free and incrementally institution-building democracy and identifying with freedom and as European largely. And that old idea
trying to move itself out from the Soviet influence, historic, cultural, and otherwise.
Yeah, and I think that even the annexation of Crimea, and again, others articulate this much better than I do, but it's clear to me from the time spent and that it's an old idea that there is this really big group of pro-Russian sympathizers. That was true, but this is a new Ukraine, and while you're going to find pockets of that, even in the East, it's not what it was. And in fact, I think the annexation of Crimea has worked significantly against Russian interests, as is everything this so-called brilliant strategist does. He's really just a boring automaton who is a kind of antiquated CEO, and his company is systematically failing, and we give him so much credit, and I think too much. And I don't think he's crazy either, and I don't think he'll use nuclear weapons.
But you've said in other interviews that he suffers from a collapse of imagination.
Yeah, and that's a dangerous thing all its own. And it's a dangerous thing. It's a concerning thing for the mental health that will be encountered in Russia when this war is over. Because people live with that kind of deficit of imagination only for so many generations before there's some kind of it's been said that the wall came down and the perestroika happened less because of Gorbachev and Solidarity and Reagan than it was because of black market Beatles records and 501 genes. And I think that that's true, that there had been a moment of exposure to, not having your thoughts written for you. And wanting to be part of the bigger world. I don't think that we did ourselves any favor by dancing the night away, that the Cold War was over while a lot of the Russians didn't have the experience, and gangsterism and kleptocracy took over, and simple people were never got to dance like we were.
Right. They kind of got ground under by the oligarchs. But
And
let's
now-
back to the Zelenskyy and the origins of this.
Yeah, so the origin. We were going to do this story about this comedic actor who had
a successful one, a really good one.
and playing a rural history teacher that becomes president on a very successful television show, The Servant of the People, which people can look up and see, and should, because he's a very talented actor and very good writing. And also kind of a window into what would be his presidency. And then COVID happened, and we were stalled in doing the documentary. I met him first over Zoom during that period, and I said to him that I wanted to, I really didn't want him to fully agree to do it with us until he'd met me face to face without a camera, because I wanted to believe that I could get a certain kind of unguarded trust that while he was likely to participate, I wanted it to get a little more personal. And I felt that, we only know if we connect when in a room. And long story shortened, it just happened that by the time we were actually able to get in a room, it was 23 February 2022. And agreed that we would start shooting this documentary the next day.
The next day.
And we went back to our hotel to prepare for the next day, the first day of shooting with President Zelenskyy, and laid our heads down to get some sleep, and the rockets came in. And this young guy that I had met that day was now wartime president. And I was surprised that we got a call. Of course, we were up all night, and I say in the movie, the air raid sirens escorted us into daybreak, and the city had taken several hits. The airport had been taken by Russian commandos, and that was about 15 kilometers away. We were being told anything from immediately to 72 hours by the time Kiev would be completely encircled. And we got the call that he was still going to honor our meeting that day, and the first day of shooting. And so our lighthearted take on a comedic actor turned president guy got rewritten by 150,000 Russian criminal invaders.
Mm-hmm. You say in the movie that it would surprise any journalist or quasi-journalist that you did not walk into that encounter with him now being a unhappily christened wartime president with a set of questions. Right. Did you feel within yourself any shift in what this project was inevitably going to become and what your role in it needed to be?
I think I say in the film, I hoped it would be useful. I hope the film would be useful. I hope the film will be useful. I think what I actually said also about the journalists is that people will scoff. Listen, I'm really used to journalists scoffing. While certainly there are some who take exception to the work I've done when I've done journalism, legitimately take exception to things. I also know some extremely acclaimed journalists and great journalists who actually hear mine as a worthy voice. But I do know that there's also a certain green-eyed monsterism that happens when, like, who the hell are you to get the scoop?
Critics have accused Sean Penn of being a globe-trotting busybody or a foreign policy amateur. His movie addresses this. In our conversation, he opened up about what he's learned and what he regrets. This is The Takeout, and that's next.
And I'm mostly proud of the positions I've taken, just not the way I've taken them a lot of times.
Welcome back to The Takeout. Sean Penn doesn't hide his politics, and he's certain that there are not two sides to Russia's war on Ukraine. From his perspective, it's a crime that's inflicted needless suffering, and it must be stopped. And Ukraine needs more help than it's currently receiving from the West. Penn is outspoken about all of that. About his past political involvement, Penn is reflective and slightly apologetic.
Because I'm a known actor, if I've been so allergic to the idea of taking a camera or archiving any of the things that I've done, in this world of things. And because as soon as a camera near me, the people assume, oh, look, he's just trying to self-advertise. He wants to hold a baby, in a bad place or something. And also, if you're negotiating with people and you want to take a tough position, it's not so great when you're photographing the thing.
Right, when the camera's right over either your shoulder or theirs.
Yeah. But I was convinced on this one that, look, this is what all of those trips have been like. Mm-hmm. I'm not sitting there saying, asking the tough academic question. I'm just going over there to try to take it in. And I thought, well, by having the camera there, by making a documentary, I can kind of offer people who can't afford it or wouldn't have that access to sort of, jump in the backpack with me and check it out. And yeah, they're going to have to hear my opinions, but that's not what the movie is. And the movie is made for, I would ask people that loathe me, and I got plenty of people that like me also, but I'm aware of, all the...
Where you are and where you stand.
Yeah, I'm still...
And how you're viewed in some quarters.
Yeah, but I got a very happy life. I'm fine with all of that, but, I don't pay attention to social media stuff. I don't think anybody should. You're not going to find people who have good attitudes there. But this movie, at its heart, should be for everyone to have that seat. And trust me, my academic prowess will not get in your way because I never intend to demonstrate that. I just go and take it in. I'm not a good small talker. I'm not good at that stuff. Whenever I've gone away, this is kind of what it's always looked like. I sit there and I listen to people and I try to retain what I can. But it's for average Joe or Joanne or however someone identifies in America who just has a hard time getting the context of what's happening there. In this case, why I think most certainly that we should be much more robust with our immediate support and save ourselves a lot of money by doing it long term.
And if we do become that, would that satisfy your sense of this film having been useful?
Yeah.
Is that how you define usefulness?
I want usefulness to equate with a unity. I want to talk to people. I want to listen to people. I want to realize that, I've participated in a lot of complaint culture and angry or just, cheap words about leaderships and people or thoughts. And if we're not willing to admit we're part of the problem and try to make a change, I will make mistakes again, And I'm mostly proud of the positions I've taken, just not the way I've taken them a lot of times, because it's true. We've alienated each other, and just because there's this wealth of I'm sorry. I think of it as a kind of Trumpism kind of attitude, but I know people who believe in that guy. Mm-hmm. I know some great people who believe in him. Mm-hmm. I don't think they have the information. I don't think they're doing their children any favor. And there's not a lot of them, and there's less of them that really. But that guy is not really the issue, right? Mm-hmm. It's what's the hunger that's getting us so pushed from each other? Right. And we really need to start building our mindset as a community for our kids' sake.
For those who may not know, since you mentioned it, you're proud of the positions you've taken, but you said not always proud of how you took them. Is there an example that is most resonant to you?
Yeah, I probably said really nasty things about President Bush, and I do think it was we were lied to about things, and it was offensive, and And, you know, this is a guy of service and, from all reports, a really kind person. What leads to the systemic adaptation of this stuff, often I don't know. But that's like a quick example of somebody. America gets the leadership it deserves. Well, the part of me that deserves, obviously, I'm glad I wasn't am not a more impactful contributor in the negative, but a contributor. Mm-hmm. And then when we lose, when you start having Bush nostalgia, you start recognizing, hey, I should have handled this with a much more sober temperament because too much is at stake. It's the same thing I believe about the left and the right in America right now. Even very popular Democratic politicians that say, it's no excuse that the other side's doing it. High road doesn't mean soft. Mm-hmm. It means relentlessly clear-minded and knowing that it's about moving the ball forward. Once in a while, there's a Hail Mary pass for someone to throw because the bleeding has to stop. Mm-hmm. But by and large, anybody on the left or the right who is going to promote them and their ideals over the possibilities that are real, be able to put the calculator next to it and figure out where the money is or where it's going to come from. Mm-hmm. And recognize that if we claim to be a democracy or a republic with a democratic principle, then we don't get to be entirely right. It's just a humility we've got to try to start adopting and understand that what do these people really believe and want, and how much of it is about language. Mm-hmm. And I always use the example of, why would anyone on the left, because their constituency, let's say, is very left and likes it when they claim themselves a socialist, why would you use that word when you could say to someone who's, let's say, conservative, are you glad that when that person tried to break into your grandmother's house, that she was able to dial 911. Mm-hmm. Thank God, they say. Thank God. Mm-hmm. And when they arrived, which of her credit cards did she use to pay for it? Oh, none? Okay, that's socialism. Mm-hmm. Your firefighters, but it isn't, because socialism is something that we know what it means to those who have suffered under it. Mm-hmm. It's an avoidable distraction. And leaders are the ones who have the highest responsibilities to language.
To use that language and use it carefully and precisely. So people can hold them accountable.
When leaders say, I'm not... the governor of the Republicans, and I'm the governor of this state, or presidents, or whatever else. Okay, well, if you're going to do that, then you got to be respectful of all of this.
Across the spectrum.
Right.
When we come back, more from the movie Superpower and the voices and experiences of civilians suffering daily terror and how they can and do cope and fight on, looking for hope and humor amid death and destruction.
Humor is the vocalization of courage.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Russia's war targets civilians relentlessly. When Russia engages with Ukraine's military, it loses more than it wins. But its assaults on civilian targets, when they succeed, are devastating and grisly. Ukraine intercepts some missiles, but not all. Sean Penn went to a bombed-out apartment complex and met the survivors, picking up the pieces.
This was the living room, that was the bedroom, and restroom. Yeah, this is not structurally sound anymore, is it?
No.
So what are you doing now? Just hearing out the things that can be salvaged?
Yeah, so I actually asked some military guys to help me out. They came
Yeah.
here, they clear everything. They try to make sure that we actually can take anything. So I try to find like really sensitive stuff, like maybe pictures or like some other stuff. Yeah, that's it. Like I just wanted to find something.
These voices, the spirit within them. I asked Sean what it meant in the course of making the film and what it means as the war grinds on.
That we should not let chaos panic us, but strengthen us. That humor is a kind of love, a weapon, but ultimately, humor is the vocalization of courage and of empowering those we care about with courage. And boy, have they got it. The railroad has a motto, the Ukrainian railroad has a motto, iron and soft, and it's indicative of that they're going to be iron in their defense of their freedom. But there is no iron if they give up their humanity. Their softness. Mm-hmm. I think there's nobody I see it in more. Well, I see it certainly in President Zelenskyy. In the movie, though, and this is truly representative of what's going on in that culture there, that great country of people, is Juice.
Tell my audience who Juice is.
Andrei was, so there's a story that a pilot, immediately upon the invasion by Russia, took to the skies over Kiev and, took on all of these more sophisticated aviation assets of the Russians.
Single-handedly.
And,
the myth goes, yeah.
Andrei, Juice, we'll call him Juice. That was his call sign as a pilot, as a fighter pilot. He talks. It wasn't one person, but it was true, and he was significant among them.
The Ghosts of Kiev, it's a real story, but not about just one person. It's about all the team, and our unit is still securing the city and our citizens.
So Juice is the part of this Ghost of Kiev.
And he is reason enough to see this film. Mm-hmm. His presence is so beautifully humble and gentle. And I knew from Americans who had trained with him, American fighter pilots, their admiration, their respect for this guy. He has such a presence of gentleness that you trust that this is not the warring, the Ukrainian side of it, that we should oppose, and is not hawkish to support.
I didn't know the Ukrainian railroad motto, but having now seen the film several times, Juice is that iron and soft.
Yeah. So,
but now let my audience know the heartbreaking part of this.
Well, he really dreamed flying F-16s, and I met him in Washington, D.C. while we were shooting the film originally, and he was here as a significant lobbyist, I suppose, for it. I mean, he came to plead the case with a few other pilots and a significant activist, Yulia Marashevska from Ukraine, and they'd come here and to talk to leaders on the Hill and to media, and we struck up a friendship. And when he went back to Ukraine, I would sometimes, there was an encrypted way to get to him. Hey, what are you doing? And then he'd say, it's about to go wheels up. And what was it, a couple of weeks after, I think it was in July, that they announced that there would be this, it was going to take forever, but that finally they were acknowledging that the resources, they being the NATO partners, and that the resources would be made available for F-16s. And he was, I think it's a L-39, which is kind of a light attack aircraft, a little bit south of Kiev, and killed a couple of weeks ago.
And the film is dedicated to him.
The film's dedicated to him and to all the others that have lost their lives. And last week I met his mother, who is this extraordinary woman, who is, I'm going to guess, will be sort of symbolically the mother of the Ukrainian Air Force, because she is going forward with his mission, and brought some of the other pilots, and the resolve to, be a pillar of strength is really moving. She's very well spoken in English, so I would expect that Americans will have the opportunity to hear from her, and therefore from Jews, because she's going to carry on his presence in this whole thing.
As will the movie. Superpower. Sean Penn, thank you.
Thanks.
War leaves casualties and memories, as well as legacies. They leave much more behind: hatred, vengeance, sometimes worse. In Juice's case, the Ukrainian pilot leaves behind a mother who will not let his cause or his sacrifice die. That's part of Ukraine's story, and the one Sean Penn tells in Superpower. This is The Takeout. We'll see you next week.